So you talk a lot about the importance of religion, and especially, you know, the Constitution being for moral and religious people. Do you foresee that religion returning to the United States? And if so, do you think it will be by like a grassroots movement or by some kind of policy change?
It will be led by the laity. I'm pretty convinced of that. And I do think that there will be a return to religion, true religion. You know, everybody has some kind of religion. You know, ultimately all politics is theological. But I mean even a return to something approximating true religion. The reason for this is that fashionable atheism of the mid-2000s has been revealed as nothing more than a publishing phenomenon. It was so weak. As Alvin, oh, there we go. We've got some of my friends back. Hello. I wonder if they're religious or atheistic, or, well, I might not have the chance to chat with them. I think it was Alvin Plantinga, the Calvinist philosopher at the Catholic College, who said that the new atheists of the 2000s were much less impressive than the old atheists who tried to make an argument for it. But there's no good argument for atheism. I think that fad has passed, and the fashionable materialism, the kind of apathy toward deeper questions that typified Gen X and the millennials, I think that's gone. And when I travel around the country, I go all over this great country. Sometimes I travel on holy days of obligation or on Sundays, and I go to plenty of churches, and I notice when I go to the traditional churches, the median age is like 8 because of all the kids. But even if you take the kids out of it, the median age is about 24, and they've all got 10 kids somehow. I don't know how. And you know, it's packed to the gills, even more so than the more liberal, worldly churches and parishes. So I know I'm a conservative, and I have to say that the sky is constantly falling and everything's going to pot. But on that bit, I see a glimmer of hope, which is good, because hope is a theological virtue and a demand made of us by God.
Thank you so much for coming to speak today. Though I don't always agree with you, I did find this talk very interesting because it made me reframe this topic. I don't still agree with you, but I think I'm thankful for that. So wanted to put that out there. First of all, do you believe Christianity is inherently better than the other Abrahamic religions? And if you do, why?
Well, I'm a Christian, so of course I believe in Christianity. And inasmuch as a religion contradicts Christianity, I don't believe in that religion. So a brief explanation for the hope that lives within me, I suppose, is I believe that Jesus Christ is who he says he is. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. I believe that he was begotten of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary. He became man, the second person of the Holy Trinity, dwelt among us, lived, was crucified, died, and was buried, harrowed hell, and redeemed mankind. I think he was resurrected on the third day. This would be one sign of that. I think there are 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection. I think the apostles all went off to the various corners of the earth, most of them to be killed. I don't think they would have done that for a joke. I don't think they would have done that because they were all just totally crazy. I don't think they were all mistaken. I just think the evidence is very strong. And so C.S. Lewis has a little trick, which is he says that Christ can be Lord, liar, or lunatic. And when you encounter him in the text and in the sacred tradition, he doesn't seem like a lunatic. When you encounter him, he doesn't seem like a liar. He seems quite truthful, and we have faculties of reason to separate truth from falsehood. And so then it would seem that he would have to be Lord. A Jewish friend of mine suggested a fourth L, which is that it could be a legend. But I just don't think that's true, because one, the gospel accounts were written very shortly after the crucifixion, you know, within living memory. The rest of the New Testament too. Some of the epistles were written even more earlier on. But then furthermore, you have non-Christian historians attesting to this, and then you just have the rapid spread of the faith. And to say nothing of the many miracles that have occurred throughout the millennia. And then a final bit I'll take from Hilaire Belloc, because I specifically am Catholic, a mackerel-snapping papist. And some people look to all the terrible, crazy things that have happened in the Catholic Church, and they say, why would you want to be part of that? How could you possibly think that's really the church? And Hilaire Belloc said that he has to take it as a matter of faith that the Catholic Church is really divinely instituted. But one evidence for the non-believer of its divine institution is that no other organization conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight.
Can I just quickly, so I understand why you would believe Christianity, but it sounded like you made the claim that there was something inherently better about Christian doctrine than, say, Islamic doctrine. Maybe we can go there.
Yes, I think that it's true. And so inasmuch as Islam contradicts Christianity, for instance, contradicting the divinity of Christ, or for instance, extolling the total transcendence of Allah, as the Islamic historian Ibn Hazm would detail, contrary to the Christian view in which God is identified with the Logos, the divine logic of the universe, inasmuch as there are those disagreements, then I would hold that Christianity is true, and therefore a superior religion if you're going to practice one.
So do you believe then that Judaism and Islam are inferior by any other nature, just by the fact that it's contradicting? That's your only contention?
Of course, the way to judge a religion is whether it's true or not. So, religion is just a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. So, it's not like I would say, I'm not Jewish because I don't like their hats. In fact, I love their hats and I want a shtreimel. I think they're very cool. They're expensive, but they're nice-looking hats. It's not that I say, I wouldn't be a Muslim because I don't like the food or something. The food is very nice. It's just merely a question of which I think is most persuasive and which I think is true, and so that would be the criterion for the superiority of one theological view or another.
I agree with you that conquest could be righteous, right? We just disagree on the religion part, that's fine. My question is, the Abrahamic God clearly commands us not to kill innocent people, and it says it's a vicious, evil act. Mm-hmm. And it happens to be that settlers now and historically have actually killed innocent people. I mean, that's historically a confirmed fact by every scholar. So how do you justify that as a Christian?
I would justify it according to just war, which is a concept that goes back to pagan antiquity and then is developed beautifully within the church, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas in particular, and then is developed, even later after the schoolmen and by non-Catholics and all sorts of rational people. And there are two aspects of just war. There is the question of justice in going to war, and then there's the question of justice in conducting war. And there are all sorts of criteria for that. To your point, yes, wars inevitably entail the death of innocents. And so does that mean that war is never justified? No, war is sometimes justified. But there are criteria by which the war must be justified. Half a dozen of which one could recite, for each case. So, I know that that's not a really zingy answer that you could write in one bullet point on the back of a napkin, but as a priest friend of mine once pointed out, shallows are clear, and shallow thinking is clear, and profound things are a little murkier and muddier. I don't think there are very many pacifists in this room. I don't think pacifism is morally persuasive in any way. I don't think that there's anything particularly good or moral about letting the cruel rape the earth, for instance. So, if we're recognizing that there would be some instance in which a war would be justified, then we need to probe that matter further. And in the case of conquest, some conquests can be justified. Some are less easily justified. It is why, in my talk, I distinguished between some of the indigenous conquests, which were either purely for land and plunder, or worse, to sacrifice virgins to demons and things like that, and other kinds of conquests, which were justified for higher purposes. For instance, Hernan Cortez conquering those demon-worshipping, human-sacrificing Aztecs, that would seem to be a rather justified conquest, especially to spread the faith. The particularity here, I think, is what really matters. This is not to ever justify the killing of innocents, but war is a messy thing, and it's why for thousands of years now the brightest minds have set limitations around it.
So people do incur sin when they kill innocent people, even though if the conflict
not
large? Or? Not
necessarily. If one is engaging in a just war and one is not intending to kill an innocent person, if one has a proportional response, if one is going to war for a good cause, if one has the right motivations, you can go down the list of justifications, then one would not necessarily incur a sin for that. It's certainly a sin to commit murder, but that's why we're drawing a distinction here between a murder and a killing in a just war.
I had a question more around atheism. So the noted atheist, Christopher Hitchens, said, morality does not come from religion, it comes from humanism. And it's stolen by religion for its own purposes. And I wonder what you think about that quote.
Not very much, I guess, is what I think about it. I would be curious as to what his argument is. Does he draw his argument from some ancient atheist society? Maybe we call it Redditistan or something, and it's where all the ancient atheists lived before the development of that awful religion totally changed the course of human history. I don't see that because all societies have some kind of religious foundation, because even when we're just discussing practical political matters, those rest on moral considerations, and moral considerations rest on epistemological considerations, how we can know anything at all. And epistemological considerations rest on anthropological considerations. What is man? How are we possibly to know anything? Anthropological considerations rest on ontological considerations. What does it even mean to be? And ontological considerations ultimately rest upon theological questions. What is? What is being anyway? So you can't escape it, and the atheists can't escape it, which is why Christopher Hitchens spent all of his latter years debating religious people. I saw Christopher Hitchens at the 92nd Street Y once debate Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. And Shmuley was right. Shmuley should have won the debate, but Christopher Hitchens was a little faster and has that fun accent, so he seemed to win the debate. And I think that's what a lot of the atheists did in the mid-2000s. But even to that quote you just read, I don't even know how to engage with it because I don't know what the argument is. He's just saying, I don't like religion, basically.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's basing his theory on the Hobbesian state of nature, which he believes everything derives from there, and then you put laws, morals, and ethics on top of that, which don't necessarily have to come from religion itself.
Sure. I mean, if my grandma had wheels, she'd be a wagon, I guess, if we're going to accept ridiculous premises. But by the way, Hobbes, too. I'm not the biggest Hobbes man in the world. He's the grandfather of liberalism. If John Locke is the father of liberalism, Hobbes is sort of the grandfather of liberalism. But he was very confused about a lot of things, politically and religiously. But even Hobbes, I don't think, would have called himself an atheist. I think Hitchens is being a little generous.
He definitely wasn't an atheist. I just think the principles that he stood for about the state of nature and then evolving from there. I think he was a religious man. I think, in fact, he supported the king in correlation with religion and state. But just the principles of, do you necessarily need religion for a society to function? I would say he probably didn't say that.
You need religion for, to put Christopher Hitchens aside, because you're clearly a much more thoughtful and intelligent person than the late Christopher Hitchens, R.I.P. They say don't speak ill of the dead, so I'll say a prayer for him later on. I feel sort of bad. Morality requires religion because morality refers to the moral law, and the moral law must have a moral lawgiver. And if the best answer that the atheists can muster is that, well, it's just something the humans made up, then there's no morality. Then it's just a fiction. It's a kind of noble lie according to which we all live. But if it's a fiction and we all become aware that it's a fiction, then it ceases to exist.
Just to preface my question, I think we are going to have a bit of a fundamental disagreement here, which is okay, and I think that's honestly what our country's all about. But there's been a lot of discussion tonight about sort of reigniting the flame of our founding fathers that they attempted to instill in us back in 1776. So I'd just like to direct our attention to something that Thomas Jefferson spoke of. He referred to the First Amendment as a necessary wall of separation of church and state. Jefferson himself was a religious man, but he truly believed in the separation of church and state. So that's sort of where I fall on the issue. So I would just love to hear your response to that.
Sure. So do you know where that line comes from?
No.
So the line comes from a private letter of Thomas Jefferson. It is one of two lines ever cited by the secularists for keeping religion out of public life. The other one is a line where they say that America was in no way founded on the Christian religion. So said John Adams, except John Adams never said that. It was a line that was negotiated by a Jeffersonian diplomat. It was in the Treaty of Tripoli. It was a throwaway line to get the Muslim pirates to stop capturing our sailors. None of that appears in the Constitution. None of that appears in the Federalist Papers. It doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't appear in any of the serious documents and writings of the Founding Fathers. Thomas Jefferson was probably the most liberal, prominent Founding Father, and he gets one line in one private letter. that view simply did not have the force of law or public support at the founding of our country, or at basically any time in our country's history. Contrary to what modern liberals would have you believe, not only does the First Amendment not kick religion out of public life, it doesn't even prohibit the establishment of a state church. The reason that the First Amendment Establishment Clause prohibits a church established at the national level is because there already were established churches at the state level that went on unmolested for decades. In our proclamations, even from the religiously slightly wobbly founding fathers, men like Benjamin Franklin, they all gave thanks to God. John Adams made clear that the morality, also in a private letter, that the morality for America ought to be the Christian morality, that was the one suited to it. John Jay gave great thanks that we were a Christian nation of practicing Christians who had a long history with one another. We have in God we trust on our currency. It's in our national anthem, actually, in the not very often sung fifth verse. The national anthem goes, and thus be it ever where free men shall stand between our loved home and the something consolation. I'm going to forget some of the words. But anyway, the upshot of it is, and thus be our motto, in God is our trust. That's in the national anthem. It would seem to me that the pro-religion and public life side has the winning argument here. Now, in recent decades, unfortunately, the secularists have taken a little bit of a win, especially in some court decisions since the 1990s, really going back even to the middle of the 20th century, when the Supreme Court discovered somewhere in invisible ink in the Constitution that you can't teach the Bible in schools. Most important book ever written, even if you're an atheist. That's the one we're not allowed to teach. You can teach genderqueer in schools, but you can't teach the Bible. And then another decision that said that you can't pray in schools. Again, this was created out of whole cloth by middle 20th century liberals. So that's the direction that the country has gone in, and I suppose I would just ask, do you think that the fruit of that has been good? Do you think the country is in a better place now than we were around the time of the founding, or, all things considered at other parts in our history? Or do you think that we're now so confused we don't even know the difference between a man and a woman?
I mean, I do think there are myriad of factors. I think we can all agree the direction the country's going in is not necessarily good. I think I would point to different factors such as immense polarization, which I don't think necessarily correlate to religion.
Are you sure?
I
John Jay certainly thought it did.
No, I think there are people which I don't disagree with, people whose moral compasses are guided by religion, which I think is not a fundamentally bad thing at all. But this is my point. I do just think we're going to fundamentally disagree. I do believe in secularism, and I believe in everybody's right to practice their own religion and have it shape them as a person. I just don't think it has a place in government personally.
How does one believe in secularism?
Well, personally, I think it comes from my own beliefs I would describe myself more as agnostic. I'm not entirely sure. I was raised Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed. But my belief system has sort of been crafted by not really claiming an understanding. I do believe in science, and I would think I would be a fool to deny, unequivocally, the existence of a God, because I'm not sure. Yeah. But I think there's.
I was just like you in school, man. I don't say that to students a lot because it sounds very condescending. But I was just like you. I was an atheist for 10 years, and I had a slight epistemic humility, which, as you do, which I think was very helpful. The notion that, perhaps, I don't know for certain. And then it occurred to me that every smart person ever in the history of the world has believed in God, and they've all believed in roughly the same conception of a God, some closer than others. And it occurred to me that there's more to life than just matter. And the reason I even phrased the question as I did is because the very notion of belief would seem to speak to something deeper than just fleshiness. And when we start speaking about the metaphysical world, then I think a lot of the arguments for atheism just totally collapse. And I think probably you're going to end up as a rather religious person if I were a gambling man.
Disagree with you most of the time, but I just wanted to push you on just one thing. So we have this million questions I could ask you, right? Colonialism, all these other things, but I think specifically just about where we're going in this country today. I think there's a very important conversation to be had about the founding. So I think a lot of conservatives have this idea, right, of the founders being this very religious group of people who, like you just mentioned, founded this country with very good intentions, trying to raise it up as the city on a hill, an example for all the world to follow. And there's that question of the religiosity. But, we have very good evidence that our first president, George Washington, for example, was a Freemason. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Bible in which he removed every single word of God. He mentioned
The
name
miracles,
God.
yeah.
He was a deist. John Adams was a Unitarian. You being a traditional Catholic, I'm sure you would very much disagree with someone who denies the Trinity.
Yeah.
The mention of that comment before about how in God we trust is in our coinage, right? This wasn't added until 1950 in order to contextualize that we were in the middle of the Cold War.
The motto predates it, but
Right.
it wasn't added until
Yeah,
later.
yeah,
That's
it
true.
predates it because it was coming from the Civil War. But that was basically to separate us from a very atheistic Soviet Union. I'm definitely very much in the middle, but I don't think that the libs, as many call them, are wrong to just kind of identify that, hey, maybe we need to identify a more clear picture of the founding. If we're going to talk about how great Thomas Jefferson was and how he wrote these very illustrious and noble words, let's also include the fact that he owned these slaves. Let's also include the fact that he was a very hypocritical man. These were men, not gods. They were flawed. And I don't think that it's a crazy idea just to point that out and just to establish that. That's where I'm coming from. But I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
Your first point was better than your second point, but they're all very good, and you obviously know what you're talking about. Ironically, I think you're making a more conservative point, and I might be making a more progressive point, which is namely, I don't think that we need to return to the founding. I'm not saying we need to get in a time machine and go back to 1776. I wouldn't like to do that. It's not possible to do that. You can never go backwards. I also, in response to all of your totally factual statements about the founders, I suppose my response would be, yeah, they weren't perfect. You know, we would have major disagreements over religion, though in the case of Thomas Jefferson, frankly, the man forgot more about religion than most people ever learn today. So this was also a group of extraordinarily educated people who did go a bit wrong on a number of questions. Absolutely, of course. I don't want to go back to that. They weren't perfect. The reason that I would refrain from harping constantly over all of their personal moral failings is because we all have them. You know, look, we live in a country right now that kills 800,000 babies a year, and I know there are people who support abortion. Future generations will look on that with horror in the same way that we look on the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. I promise you that. And so I would like us to be given a little bit of grace as well. And the Founding Fathers had all sorts of moral trepidations about slavery. They wrote about them. This is not some psychobabble here. You can read it in their own words. And so they were men who were captive of their time, and they did the best they could. And in some cases, they made errors. That's true. I think it is more productive, though, to focus on the philosophical and political issues that they got wrong. Because as you point out, there are a lot of them. But then you point out the answer to that, I think accidentally, which is you say, for instance, "In God we trust" was not added to our currency until the 20th century. The motto comes from the middle of the 19th century, but it was added to our currency later on. Yes, that's true. You know what I call that? Progress. I call that an improvement. And I think that...
But
yes.
I'll push you on this because you say they were products of their time. Completely understand. But with that way of thinking, we have this understanding that progressive modern ideology of human rights and fairness just came out of nowhere. Because there were people in that time who also disagreed. John Adams was a founding father that I very much respect because out of principle, he never owned a slave. He believed it was wrong. So how can we say they were products of their time when people in that time were also criticizing the institution?
Well, because there were people in Massachusetts had less of an economic need, incentive, and capture even for slavery, where it just was, than someone, say, in Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson. So there's even context between the states. You know, the colonies were quite different. We live in a more homogenized nation today. That was not the case. The Southern economy was largely dependent on slavery. It was practiced in the North, but just it wasn't as reliant. So they were men of their time. They were more conscious of the errors of their time than many of us are today of the errors of our time. You mentioned the notion of human rights, which is one that I think is a little bit fuzzy, because everyone always claims a human right to whatever it is exactly that he wants. But it comes from a good place, which is the notion of human rights comes from the notion of natural rights. And the notion of natural rights can sometimes get a little fuzzy too, but that comes from the notion of natural law, and that natural law is pretty solid. And so where does that come from? That doesn't come from some lib hippie in the 20th century. That comes from the church. That comes from the various serious thinkers of Western civilization. So I think that we can identify where people have gone wrong a little bit philosophically, or where they just made mistakes because they were imperfect men living and doing the best they can, and we can try to deal with our own battles. Just as I criticize conservatives for constantly wanting to dig up the corpse of Ronald Reagan and just repeat the same 5 lines over and over from the Gipper, I say, let the man die, you know, he did his part. He did his part, he was a good man, now we have to fight our battles too. I think the same thing of the Founding Fathers. When I refer to these great men of history and why we ought to look up to them, it is in part because we would not be here without them. And so it's an extension of filial piety. Just as you ought to go a little soft on your parents, even if they're acting like jerks sometimes, so too we ought to go a little soft on our country. Patriotism is one extension of filial piety. And we ought to go soft even on our political ancestors as well, because we are standing on the shoulders of those giants. Some of us think that we're flying, but we're not. And someday people are going to correct our errors as well. And we should hope for the same grace that we might afford to our forebears. Because otherwise then we're just going to tear everybody down, and we're going to say our country was founded by the most rotten people on the stupidest ideas, and we're all a bunch of just bags of flesh who have nothing but our own personal interest. And that's going to lead us to degradation, and no one's going to flourish from that at all.